like you say, Marconi.
Is everybody warming up, or would you like me to turn up the heating? Okay. The tunnel, the last train through here was in 1966, and afterwards the trap was lifted and the tunnel was sold to Leicester City Council. We understand for either £5 or £10. The far end of the tunnel was sold off to some developers, and they built houses above there, and I'll talk more about the end of the tunnel a bit later on in the talk. After the council bought the tunnel, they then had to think what are we going to do with it, and we've heard various suggestions were put forward to them. One of which they're going to turn it into a mushroom growing farm in here. The other one, which I quite like the idea of, was to turn it into a big wine cellar, but unfortunately neither of those came to fruition. In the 1970s and 80s, though, the council let the tunnel to two electronics companies, one called Plessy and one called Marconi. Sadly, these companies are no longer with us under those names. But they used the tunnels for developing some laser systems and some radar systems. The tunnel provided an ideal environment for doing the type of test work they needed to do. And if you look on the ceiling, behind you there's a little yellow bobbin in the ceiling there. There's one above us here, and there's another one there, and you'll see others as we go along. And there's also one on the wall here behind me. And these are hangovers from the Plessy Marconi era. This is where they would have suspended some of their wiring and test equipment from. The yellow cable you see on the wall behind you there, we put that in for the lighting, so that is mod, that's not old at all. Underneath that light, you can see a bracket on the wall underneath it there where my torch is shining. This was put in by the contractors that did the concreting. They had their hoses and their power cables were fixed to the wall with those brackets. On the wall itself, you'll notice these wooden blocks that we've got along here. These are from the railway era. This is where the signalling wires and telegraph wires would have been fixed to the wall in the railway era. You'll have also noticed as we come along various numbers on the wall, like these ones here. Everyone that used the tunnel put in their own indexing or reference system to give it so they would know whereabouts in the tunnel they were, and to give them an idea of where they had to go or where they had to do various bits of work. This 160, this tells us that we're now 160 metres in from the tunnel mouth where we came in, and these numbers increase as we carry on down the tunnel. The 8 is a hangover from the railway era. This tells us that we're 8 chains in from the tunnel mouth. The chain is one of these archaic lengths of measurements that I remember at school, and perhaps people in my era might remember as well. One chain is equal to 22 yards, which is the exact length of a cricket pitch as well. That's how we used to remember it at school. I'm not sure what the 17 refers to, but this is another user of the tunnel that had their own indexing system as well. Okay, everyone happy? Carry on then. We've passed so far along the wall. These are the original bricks that were made back in the 1820s, 1830s. So these bricks are about over 190 years old. They're a fairly crude type of brick, but nonetheless they've done the job well, they've lasted well, so they've lasted getting on for 200 years. But in various places the brickwork has deteriorated and they've had to replace it. And this is one area where it's been replaced. I'm going to shine the torch in your face there, but just behind you, you can see there's quite a distinct change in the brickwork here. These are a more modern, more sophisticated type of brick that's been put in at some time because the original bricks had either broken or damaged in some way. We don't know when this was done. My guess will be the 1920s, but that is purely a guess. And as we go along, you'll see other areas where the brickwork has been replaced. This is also a suitable place to tell you a bit more about how the railway came about to start with. It's quite an interesting story, I think. We have records of coal mining up in the Colville area from about the 13th century. And one of the main market for their coal was here in Leicester. It was transported here by horse and then later on by horse and cart. And the coal owners, or the mines in that area, had a virtual monopoly on coal sales here in Leicester. But that all changed in the middle of the 18th century with the construction of the Erewash Canal. The Erewash Canal ran down the boundary between Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire and linked up with the River Soar at the River Trent. And this enabled coal to be bought by barge from the Nottinghamshire coalfield to Leicester. And they were able, the mine owners in Nottinghamshire were able to sell their coal in Leicester at about 30% cheaper in price than the coal from Colville. This obviously got the coal owners in Leicestershire worried. All of a sudden their market was disappearing. So they had to do something about it. First of all, they constructed their own canal called the Charnwood Forest Canal, but for various reasons that was a disaster and soon fell into disuse. One of the coal owners at Whittick near Colville in the 1820s had heard about these newfangled things called steam railways that were starting to appear in the northeast of England, and he went up to have a look at the Stockton and Darlington Railway and came back home and thought the railway is the answer to our prayers of how we can get our coal to Leicester to compete with the coal on the canals. This bloke Stenson was a surveyor by training, and he mapped out a possible route from the Colville area to Leicester. But he wasn't a railway engineer and didn't know whether his proposed route was viable or not. He was talking about this problem with a colleague of his, a man called Ellis. And Ellis said, well, I know someone who might be able to help you here, and you might have heard of this man. The man Ellis knew was a chap called George Stephenson, the famous railway engineer. Ellis went up to Liverpool to see George Stephenson, where he was busy making or constructing the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, and persuaded George Stephenson to come down to Leicester to have a look at Stenson's proposal. So George Stephenson gave it the once-over and said, yes, what you're proposing is viable, it seems very sensible, and what's more, I would like to be involved in this. I think it's a real good proposition. The only problem is that I'm rather busy constructing the Liverpool and Manchester Railway at the moment, but I know someone who might be prepared to be the engineer, my son Robert. Nothing like keeping it in the family, bit of nepotism. So in fact, George and Robert Stephenson became the engineers for this line, and in fact it was Robert Stephenson that was the main engineer for this tunnel. So there's quite a strong link there with the Stephensons. Just out of interest, following up the story of the Stephensons, George Stephenson was also very impressed by the quality and amount of coal there was in the Colville area, and he was the major investor in what became known as the Snibston mine in Colville. He was the main instigator of that mine, and for 4 years he had a house halfway between Colville and Ashby at a place called Alton Grange. That's where he lived. So there's a bit about the Stephensons. We're coming up now to the second arch. You can see it coming up here, the second ventilation shaft. So once again, look up. This way you'll see daylight through there, but be warned, this ventilation shaft drips. If you stand underneath this, you will get water on your face or on your head. And if you want to avoid the water, keep to one side. I know where these two are going to stand. Of the tunnel. As well as digging from both ends of the tunnel, they also dug down from the surface, down large construction shafts to the level of the tunnel, and then worked out in either direction to link up with similar works from adjacent shafts. So the tunnel was made in a number of stages, which they then hopefully joined up together. Now remember, the tunnel was constructed back in the late 1820s, 1830s. They had no sophisticated surveying tools or things like that, no laser systems, no GPS to help them. It was just done basically by eye or using a compass to make sure they all joined up together. But in one or two places they didn't quite match up properly, and we think this is one of them. If I shine my torch down the left-hand side here, you can see there's quite a large indentation on the left-hand side. And this is where we think the two sections didn't quite join up properly, and they had to do a bit of fiddling to get them to join up here.
Is it the same on the other side?
No, well, there's a bit there. It's a bit difficult to tell. So although back at the beginning I told you that the tunnel was dead straight, strictly what I mean is the centre line of the tunnel is dead straight, and the walls aren't necessarily parallel all the way along the length of the tunnel. The tunnel itself was dug by people called navvies. These originally were people that dug the canals in the country, but with the demise of canals and the rise of railways, they moved on to railway construction. These were tough, strong people, and they were primarily Welsh, Irish or Scottish. They were considered the strongest people. The local people here were not considered strong enough to do the manual work, because the tunnel itself was dug totally by hand. There were no mechanical means available to help them. It was just dug out using pick and shovel and wheelbarrows. And each navvy was expected to dig out between 10 and 12 tons of material per day. So it gives you an idea of the workload that they had to do. These navvies were itinerant workers. They moved from job to job, and they lived in shanty towns near where they were working, so outside the tunnel mouth or above the construction shafts that have been temporary towns or villages or settlements there. These would have been fairly rowdy, bawdy places. You can imagine a lot of drinking, gambling and so on going on there. We understand from records that they mainly lived off beer and beef, and that they weren't very keen on the beef. Remember right at the beginning we talked about the shape of the tunnel, the horseshoe shape with a quite nice round arch at the top. If you look at the shape of the roof now, it's become distinctly flatter than it was at the beginning. This is due to the weight and the pressure of the earth above us distorting the brickwork. But don't worry, the tunnel has stood now for over 190 years. I think this should survive until we get out in about 15 minutes' time, so it should be all right. We're coming up to another spot where the roof leaks a bit on the right hand side. So it wants to avoid the drops of water into the
Yeah. She will. This is the one thingy, isn't it? Glenfield. It's a big one.
What, new park?
Yeah, new park. Because that other one was like that small.
Yeah. I suppose it's funny.
I think you mentioned that name Treasure. I think the previous one called the Treasure. I think I'm not sure, so I'm not from around here, but I've heard people talk about that. So here we are now at the third ventilation shaft and the first construction shaft. You'll notice this one is noticeably bigger than the other two we've walked underneath. This is going to say it was a construction shaft. This is where men and material would be wound up and down. This particular ventilation shaft is in a private garden on Fairfield Crescent. This one is here. It's in his garden. If you look up through the shaft, you can see there's a distinct change in colour. The lighter bit at the top is where the ventilation shaft protrudes above the level of the ground. They're about 10 feet tall above the ground there. The darker bit and the wetter bit at the bottom is where it's passing through earth. So here we're about 40 feet underground here at this one. If you look at the bottom of the shaft, where my torch is shining, you can see a block, and there's one over here, one on this side, and one behind me as well. We think this is where wooden beams were put in during the construction of the tunnel, where they'd have had the pulleys to wind the men up and down into the tunnel, and also to take the spoil, the material dug out. Some of the material that was dug from the tunnel would have been used to make the embankment that you walked along from the co-op, but other bits were taken up these ventilation or these construction shafts and just dumped on the top. When the tunnel was being built, there was nothing above here, just open land, and so it was just spread on the ground above here. The ventilation shafts and the tunnel portals are listed buildings. Oh, careful, you drop your torch. Are listed buildings. So if you're lucky enough or unlucky enough to have one of these in your garden, you can't do anything with it at all. You're not allowed to alter it or knock it down. You have to keep it as it is there. We have a record of at least one person being killed during the construction of the tunnel, a man called Jowett. He was a manager or supervisor of the tunnel, and he sadly fell down one of these shafts. Not this one, it's one further down there. But in memory of him, one of the roads above here is called Jowett Avenue. If anyone knows this area, they might be familiar with it. Okay, this is as far as we're allowed to take you on our tour. You're now 400 yards into the tunnel. The tunnel carries on to another 3/4 of a mile to the far end. It must be said that the scenery for the remaining 3/4 of the mile is very similar to the scenery we've passed coming up here. There's no grand vistas or anything else down there at all to see. But what we can do is walk up to the barrier, and I'll switch the light on so you can take some photographs down there.
I hope some bloke didn't chuck his garden stuff over one.
Feel free to go into the barrier. Don't rush, there's plenty of time. We can wait there as long as necessary for you all to get your photographs. On the side of the concrete, and you can get out or into the tunnel via this manhole cover in someone's garden on Copeland Avenue. That's the only way in or out at the far end. But the only people that have the key to that manhole cover are the fire brigade. They sometimes come into the tunnel to do training exercises. That's the only way out at the far end. Okay, I'm going to play around with this little bit of high-tech equipment here in a minute, while Peter gives you a bit of a story about some low-tech equipment used on the railway.
Very low-tech. Yes, that's all right. Yeah, well, the Leicester Swannington Railway ran from Swannington to Leicester. One incident happened in 1833 where a train actually hit a farm car and totally wrecked it. Nobody was hurt as far as we know. But from that, they decided a train needed a warning system. So no train before then had any sort of warning device on it. So they went to an instrument maker in Leicester and made something called the steam trumpet. And there was a pub in Thornton called the steam trumpet because we think the instrument maker lived in Thornton. And the steam trumpet, of course, is the steam whistle as we know it. Now, of course, we haven't got a steam whistle here, but my great-grandfather worked on the railway, and I've got his 1920s whistle. High-tech technology here, no batteries. So I thought I'd give you a sound of a whistle. So that's a genuine Great Central Railway whistle. Okay, you've got there.
Yes, we're all connected up, right. We can't tell you, give you an experience of what it was like when a train went through here in terms of the smoke or the steam, but what we can hopefully do is give you an idea of what the sound of a train passing through the tunnel was like. And this is an actual recording of a train passing through this tunnel made in the 1960s. Is this going to work? That gives you an idea of what the sound
It
of the
would
train
be
coming
20
through here
times
was.
louder than that.
Yeah.
Well, when did the last train go through?
1966.
1966.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that marks the end of the tour. Peter will start and lead you out when you're ready. I'll wait here. If you want to take some more photographs from the barrier here, feel free to do, and then I'll lead you out. Say thank you all very much indeed for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. You'll have noticed on the way in, we've got a little sales stand there. Where we sell various publications about the tunnel, the Leicester and Swannington, the Leicester and Swannington Railway, Leicester and Swannington Railway, and other bits of industrial history in Leicestershire as well. Also on there is our donations bucket, which we would like you to notice, please. We use the money we collect from there to buy the equipment that we use to bring you into the tunnel. We're all carrying air monitors, walkie-talkies, various other bits of first aid kit as well we have to provide to look after you all, so it all goes towards the cost of that. So once again, I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of what's left of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.